My name is Hannah Brooks. I am 31 years old. At my own wedding, my husband's family laughed at my father in front of everyone. Not quietly, not behind his back. Right there, in the middle of a room filled with crystal chandeliers and white roses, where every guest was dressed in silk and confidence, they looked at my father like he didn't belong. They mocked his suit, called it outdated, said it looked like something from another decade, and then they moved him. A waiter approached my parents with a polite smile and a quiet voice, gesturing toward the back of the hall, near the kitchen doors. I saw my father hesitate for just a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he nodded, like he always does, like he didn't want to make trouble, and stood up. My mother followed. I didn't move. I stood there in my wedding dress, smiling at someone I wasn't listening to, my hands folded in front of me, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, while my parents were being quietly removed from the center of the room. And Daniel, my fiancé, the man I was about to marry, was standing a few feet away, watching. For a moment, our eyes met. I waited. I didn't even know what I was waiting for. A word, a step forward, anything. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just smiled, like it was nothing, like this was normal. Like my father being pushed to the back of the room was just part of how things worked. That was the moment something shifted inside me. But before I tell you what I did next, you need to understand how we got here. The reception hall was everything Daniel's family had promised it would be. Elegant, impressive, controlled. The kind of place where every detail had been planned down to the inch, where the lighting was soft and golden, the music was low and perfectly timed, and every table told you exactly who belonged where. The main tables near the stage were filled with people who looked like they had always lived in rooms like this. Men in tailored suits, women in dresses that probably cost more than my parents' car. Daniel's parents, Richard and Evelyn Carter, sat at the center, surrounded by business partners and longtime friends. They didn't need to raise their voices to be noticed. The room adjusted around them. And then there were my parents. Robert Brooks, my father, spent his entire life working with his hands. Heating systems, broken units, anything that needed fixing. He was the one people called when something stopped working. He wore a suit that night, one he had carefully chosen weeks in advance, asking me twice if it looked right for the occasion. It was clean, pressed, simple, but in that room, it was enough to make him stand out. My mother, Linda, stood beside him, her hand lightly resting on his arm. She had done her best too. A soft blue dress, her hair carefully styled. A quiet pride in her eyes as she looked at me earlier that evening, like everything they had worked for had led to this moment. For a few minutes, it felt real. I remember catching my father's eye from across the room. He gave me a small nod, the kind he used to give when I was a kid and I did something right. My mother smiled, her eyes shining, and I told myself everything was fine. But then I noticed something else, the way Evelyn Carter was watching them. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't talking. She was just observing, measuring. She leaned toward her husband, Richard, and said something under her breath. He followed her gaze, looking directly at my parents. His expression didn't change, but there was a pause, a decision. And a few minutes later, the waiter appeared. Now my parents were seated at the very back of the room, near the kitchen doors, where every time they opened, a rush of noise and heat spilled out. Plates clattering, voices calling, the kind of place guests weren't meant to stay. From where I stood, I could still see my father, sitting straight, trying to look comfortable, his hands resting on the table, like everything was exactly as it should be. My mother was smiling, but not the same way she had earlier. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it yet. I didn't have the full picture. But standing there, in a room full of people celebrating my future, I realized I didn't recognize the place I was about to build my life in. And for the first time that night, I started to wonder if I had made a mistake. I kept my eyes on my father. From where I stood, I could still see him at that small table near the kitchen doors, sitting straighter than usual, like posture alone could make up for everything else. He had always done that. When things felt uncomfortable, when a room didn't quite welcome him, he didn't shrink. He adjusted. Quietly. Respectfully. That was who he was. Robert Brooks never learned how to make himself look important. He didn't know how to speak in polished sentences or carry himself like the men seated at the front tables. But he knew how to fix things. Broken heaters in the middle of winter, air units in the middle of July, machines other people gave up on. If something stopped working, my father stayed until it worked again. That was his version of control. Growing up, I didn't think of us as poor. We didn't use that word. We just lived differently. Our house in Gastonia was small, but it was always warm. Not just because of the heating system he kept running with spare parts and long nights, but because of the way my parents held everything together. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while my father came home late, his hands rough, his shirt smelling faintly of oil and metal. He would wash up, sit down across from me, and ask about my day like it was the most important thing in the world. He never missed that. My mother, Linda, worked long shifts at a rehabilitation clinic outside Charlotte. She didn't complain either. She just kept moving, kept making sure there was food on the table, clothes ready for school, bills somehow paid on time. They never said, "We can't afford that." They just found another way. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by people who measured value in numbers I couldn't even see, I realized something I had always known, but never had to defend before. Everything I was came from them, not from connections, not from money, not from a last name that opened doors, from them. I watched as my father reached for the water glass in front of him. His hand was steady, but slower than usual, like he was aware of being watched. My mother leaned slightly toward him, saying something softly. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the tone. Reassuring. Always reassuring. She had spent her whole life doing that, making sure no one felt the weight she was carrying. For a moment, I wanted to walk over there. Just leave everything behind. The guests, the music, the expectations, and sit with them. Pretend this night belonged to us, not to anyone else. But I didn't move, because this wasn't just my wedding. It was Daniel's world, and I had stepped into it willingly. I had told myself it would be different, that love would be enough to bridge the gap between where I came from and where he stood. That respect would come with time. I believed that. I believed that the way my parents had built their lives, quietly, honestly, without needing anyone's approval, would eventually be seen for what it was, something solid, something real. Across the room, my father gave a small nod to someone passing by, even though they barely acknowledged him. He didn't take offense. He never did. He simply remained who he was. And somehow, that made everything harder to watch. Because in a room like this, being good wasn't enough. Being decent wasn't enough. And for the first time, I felt the gap between my life and this one, not as a difference, but as a divide. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. And growing. I didn't notice it all at once. That would have been easier. If someone had said something openly, clearly, something I couldn't ignore, I might have understood sooner. But that's not how it worked with Daniel's family. With them, everything came wrapped in politeness. Smiles that lasted just a second too long. Compliments that didn't quite feel like compliments. It started the first time I met them. Daniel had taken me to dinner at his parents' home in Myers Park. One of those neighborhoods where the houses don't just sit on the street, they announce themselves. Large windows, manicured lawns, everything in place like it had been designed to be seen. I remember standing at the front door, smoothing my dress, telling myself to just be respectful, just be myself. Evelyn Carter opened the door. She looked at me for a second before smiling, the kind of smile that acknowledged my presence without quite welcoming it. "You must be Hannah," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just precisely. Richard Carter was in the dining room when we walked in. He didn't get up right away. He nodded once, then returned his attention to whatever was on the table in front of him. It wasn't rude, not exactly, but it wasn't inviting either. Dinner that night was quiet, in a way I couldn't explain. Not awkward, controlled. Every topic stayed safe. Every question had a purpose. Where did I work? How long had I been there? What did my parents do? When I said my father worked in heating and air repair, there was a pause. "Just a second," Evelyn smiled again. "That must be stable work," she said. I nodded. It is. She didn't ask anything else. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table like he wanted me to ignore it. And I did. Because nothing she said was technically wrong. That was the pattern. Little moments. Easy to dismiss. Harder to forget. A few weeks later, at a small gathering with some of their friends, I heard someone ask Evelyn how Daniel and I met. She told the story smoothly, leaving out the part about the hospital waiting room, the panic, the reason I was there in the first place. She's very grounded, Evelyn said instead, her tone light. The word stayed with me longer than it should have. Grounded. It sounded like a compliment, but it didn't feel like one. Daniel never said anything against them. Not directly. When I brought it up once, carefully, he shook his head and smiled. They just take time, he said. They're used to a certain environment. I told myself that made sense. People grow up differently. Expectations aren't always the same. I tried harder after that. I chose my words more carefully. Paid attention to how I dressed when I was around them. Learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. I didn't change who I was, but I adjusted. Because I wanted this to work. Because I believed him when he said it didn't matter. Standing in that reception hall now, watching my parents sit at that back table, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly before. This wasn't new. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was consistent. The looks, the pauses, the way certain conversations stopped when I entered a room. The way my parents were being treated now, as if their presence had to be managed, contained. I glanced toward the main table again. Evelyn was speaking to one of the guests, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. Richard sat beside her, calm, controlled, like nothing unusual had happened. Daniel was standing near them, laughing at something someone said. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look conflicted. He looked like he belonged. And for the first time, I started to question whether I ever truly had. It didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement. No one stood up and said anything out loud. No one needed to. In a room like that, things didn't have to be explained to be understood. They were simply arranged. Dinner service began with a quiet shift in the room. Music softened, conversations lowered, and staff moved with a kind of practiced precision, guiding guests to their tables. It looked seamless from the outside, like everything else that night. But when I started paying attention, I noticed something. The way people were being placed. The tables closest to the stage filled first. Daniel's parents, Richard and Evelyn Carter, their business partners, people whose names I had heard more than once in conversations I wasn't fully part of. They didn't need to ask where they were sitting. It was already decided. The next set of tables filled just behind them. Extended family, longtime friends, people who belonged, but not quite at the center. I stood near the stage, still surrounded by guests, still smiling when someone spoke to me. But my eyes kept drifting across the room, looking for my parents. I expected someone to come for them, to guide them forward, to bring them closer, to place them somewhere that made sense. But no one did. Instead, I saw a server approach them again. The same calm smile, the same quiet tone, and gesture, just slightly, toward the back of the room, further than before. I felt something tighten in my chest. My father looked up, just for a moment, as if he might say something this time, as if he might ask a question. But then he didn't. He gave that same small nod and stood up. My mother followed, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. They didn't resist. They didn't make a scene. They simply accepted it. I took a step forward, just one. But before I could move any further, someone touched my arm. "Hannah, over here," a voice said brightly. I turned to see Chloe Carter, Daniel's younger sister, already smiling like everything was perfectly on schedule. "We need you for photos before everyone sits," she added, her tone light, practiced. I glanced past her, trying to keep my parents in sight. They were moving now, walking slowly through the room, past tables that grew quieter as they passed. Not silent, but aware. Like people noticed but chose not to acknowledge it. "Just a minute," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Chloe tilted her head slightly, still smiling. "It'll only take a few seconds." A few seconds. That's what I told myself. So I let her guide me back toward the front of the room, toward the lights, toward the camera, toward the place where everything still looked exactly as it was supposed to. The photographer called out instructions. Adjust your shoulders, turn slightly, smile. I did what I was told, but my focus wasn't there. It was at the back of the room. By the time the photos were done, my parents were already seated. Their table didn't look like the others. No flowers, no candle, no small details that made the rest of the room feel complete. Just a plain table set close to the kitchen doors. Every time the doors swung open, a burst of noise and heat spilled out. Voices calling, dishes clattering, the rhythm of work that guests weren't meant to hear. It wasn't a place for celebration. It was a place for overflow. From where I stood, I could see my father adjusting his chair slightly, positioning himself so he faced the room, not the doors. Like he was trying to make the best of it. My mother sat beside him, her posture careful, her smile still there, but thinner now, more deliberate. I looked around the room again. No one said anything. No one questioned it. Everything continued as planned, and that was the part I couldn't ignore. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was a decision, a quiet one, but a clear one. And standing there, surrounded by people who acted like nothing was wrong, I realized something else. If I didn't do anything, this would simply become normal. I couldn't stay where I was anymore. The music kept playing, soft and controlled, like nothing had changed. People were laughing, glasses clinking, conversations flowing the way they were supposed to. From the outside, it still looked like a perfect wedding, but I couldn't unsee what I had seen. "I'll be right back," I said quietly, to no one in particular. No one stopped me. I moved through the tables, past the center of the room, past the people who belonged there, until the lights dimmed slightly and the noise shifted. The further I walked, the less polished everything felt. And then I saw them. My parents were sitting exactly where I had left them. That small table near the kitchen doors. No decoration, no attention. Just placed there like an afterthought. My father sat straight, his hands folded together on the table. My mother sat beside him, her shoulders slightly tense, her smile still there, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. "Dad," I said softly. He looked up immediately like he had been waiting for me. "Hannah," he said, his voice steady, "you look beautiful." Like nothing was wrong. Like this was normal. "Why are you sitting here?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. "Well, she finally came to check." I turned. Evelyn Carter stood a few steps away, surrounded by two women I didn't recognize. Guests, dressed perfectly, watching with quiet interest. Evelyn's expression was calm, composed, almost amused. "We thought it would be more comfortable for them here," she said lightly. "Less overwhelming." "More comfortable?" I repeated. Richard Carter stepped forward beside her, his posture relaxed, his tone even. "Hannah," he said, as if explaining something simple. "Events like this require a certain atmosphere." I felt something tighten in my chest. One of the women beside Evelyn glanced at my father, then leaned slightly toward the other. "Did you see his jacket?" she whispered, not quite quietly enough. "It looks like it's from another era." A soft laugh followed. Another voice joined in. "And the shoes," she said. "I mean, you can tell." I didn't look at them. I looked at my father. He hadn't moved. Not really. Just a small shift in his shoulders, a slight lowering of his gaze, enough to pretend he hadn't heard, enough to protect himself in the only way he knew how. My mother reached for her glass, but her hand trembled just slightly before she steadied it. "She should be grateful," Evelyn added, her tone still smooth, still controlled, "that we made space for them at all." That was the moment it changed. Not loud, not sudden, just clear. I turned instinctively, searching for Daniel. He was standing near the center of the room, exactly where he had been before, surrounded by people who looked like they had never questioned anything in their lives. For a second, our eyes met again. I waited. I gave him that same chance, the same silent question. "Are you going to say something?" Someone leaned toward him, Chloe, I realized, and whispered something in his ear. I didn't hear the words, but I saw what came next. Daniel smiled. Then he laughed. Not awkwardly, not out of discomfort, a real laugh. And something inside me went completely still. The noise of the room faded. The music disappeared. Even the voices around me felt distant. like they belonged to somewhere else. I looked back at my parents, my father, sitting in silence, my mother, blinking quickly as she tried to hold back tears that were already there. And for the first time that night, I stopped trying to make sense of it. I stopped trying to explain it, because there was nothing left to misunderstand. This wasn't about differences. This wasn't about adjustment. This was about respect. And it wasn't there. I took a slow breath, then another. And without saying a word, I made a decision. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at Evelyn again. There was nothing left to say to her. Instead, I turned away from that table, away from the laughter, the whispers, the careful cruelty, and walked back toward the center of the room. This time, I didn't stop when someone spoke to me. I didn't pause when a guest reached out to congratulate me. I moved through them like they weren't really there, like the entire room had become something distant and secondary to what I had already seen. The closer I got to the stage, the quieter everything felt. Not because the room had changed, because I had. Behind me, I could still hear voices shifting, subtle changes in tone, the kind of awareness that spreads when something is off, but no one has named it yet. Hannah? Daniel's voice. I didn't stop. Hannah, wait. His hand caught my wrist. Not forcefully, but enough to slow me down. I turned. Up close, his expression was different. Not as relaxed as before. There was something else there now. Uncertainty, maybe even concern. What are you doing? He asked, lowering his voice like this was something we should keep between us. It's just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. I looked at him for a moment, really looked this time, as if I were seeing him without everything I had believed layered on top. My father is sitting by the kitchen door, I said quietly. Daniel exhaled, glancing briefly over his shoulder, like he was checking who might be listening. They didn't mean anything by it, he said. It's just seating. You know how these events are. I do, I interrupted, still calm, too calm. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. It's complicated, he added quickly. There are expectations. My parents. Your parents made a decision, I said. He hesitated. For a second, he didn't have an answer ready. Then he shook his head, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're overthinking this, he said. Let's not make it into something bigger than it is. Something bigger than it is. I felt the weight of that sentence settle in. Not as doubt, as clarity. I gently pulled my wrist free from his hand. I'm not making anything into anything, I said. I'm just seeing it. Daniel's expression shifted again, this time sharper. Hannah, he said, his tone tightening just slightly. This is our wedding. Let's not ruin it over something small. There it was. Small. I nodded once, not because I agreed, because I understood. For him, this could still be contained, managed, smoothed over like everything else had been. For me, it couldn't. Not anymore. Behind him, I could see his parents watching now. Not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to know they were aware. Measuring again, waiting to see how far this would go. I didn't give them anything yet. Not a scene, not a raised voice, just a decision. I'll be right back, I said. Daniel frowned slightly. Hannah. But I was already moving. This time, no one stopped me. The stage was just a few steps away, elevated slightly above the rest of the room. The microphone stood there, exactly where it had been all evening, unused, waiting for speeches that were meant to be light, grateful, predictable. For a moment, I just looked at it, at how simple it was, how easy it would be to pick it up, and how impossible it would be to undo what came after. Behind me, the room continued to shift. The music was still playing, but softer now. Conversations less certain. People noticing without knowing why. I took one step forward, then another. And as I reached for the microphone, I knew something with complete certainty. There was no version of this night where I stayed silent. The microphone felt lighter than I expected. For a second, I just held it, my fingers wrapped around something that suddenly carried more weight than anything else in that room. A soft hum echoed as I lifted it. The music didn't stop right away. People kept talking, laughing, finishing sentences that no longer mattered. "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. A few heads turned, then more. The music faded. The room shifted. "Hi," I continued, my tone steady, almost calm. "I know this isn't part of the schedule." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room, uncertain, waiting to see where this was going. I didn't smile. "I just need a moment." Silence followed. Not complete, but enough. I let it settle. I didn't rush. I didn't fill it. I let the space grow uncomfortable. Let people lean into it. Let them start paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Then I turned slightly, just enough to look toward the back of the room. "My parents are sitting back there," I said. It was simple, clear. A few people shifted in their seats, glancing over their shoulders, as if they were seeing it for the first time. "The man at that table," I continued, my voice even, "is my father." I paused again. He spent his entire life working with his hands, so I could stand here tonight. No one laughed this time. No one moved. "He never asked for anything from anyone in this room," I added. "Not respect, not recognition, not approval." I let that sit, but I think it's worth asking why he was moved. A murmur spread, quiet but unmistakable. Across the room, I saw Evelyn Carter straighten slightly in her seat. Richard's expression didn't change, but his attention was fully on me now. Daniel had moved closer to the stage. "Hannah," he said, low but sharp, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "What are you doing?" I didn't look at him. Not yet. Instead, I continued. "Because from where I'm standing," I said, "it doesn't look like a misunderstanding." The word hung there. Misunderstanding. I heard someone whisper it to another guest, like they were testing how it sounded out loud. Daniel stepped forward, closer now. "This isn't the time," he said, his voice tighter, controlled but strained. "We can talk about this privately." Privately. I finally turned to face him. "For who?" I asked quietly. He stopped. "Just for a second." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "You're making people uncomfortable." I nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "I think they should be." A sharper shift moved through the room now. No more polite laughter. No more pretending this was part of the evening. Evelyn stood. It was subtle, but intentional. The kind of movement that redirected attention without asking for it. "Hannah," she said, her voice smooth, composed. "There's no need to create a scene." Scene. The word landed differently. "I'm not creating anything," I replied. "I'm just describing what's already happening." Richard stood beside her now, his presence heavier, more deliberate. "This is inappropriate," he said, his tone firm but measured. "We can address any concerns later." Later. After the guests had gone, after everything could be contained again. I looked out across the room, at the faces watching, at the people who had noticed something was off but hadn't questioned it, at the ones who were waiting to see which version of this night would win. And for the first time, I felt something shift in my favor. Not control. Not yet. But attention. And that was enough. "For the record," I said slowly, "this isn't about embarrassment." I glanced once more toward the back. My father isn't the one who should feel out of place tonight. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, and I could feel it. The balance changing. Not finished. Not even close. But no longer entirely in their hands. I could feel the room waiting for me to lose control. That was what they expected now. Tears, anger, a bride unraveling in public. Something they could dismiss later as emotion, stress, embarrassment. For one dangerous second, I almost gave them that. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the heat in my face, the weight of every eye in the room. But then I looked past the front tables and found my father again. He was still sitting straight, still silent, still refusing to turn his humiliation into a performance for anyone else. And just like that, I understood my mistake. I had asked this room to care. That was never going to be enough. So I changed course. I lowered the microphone slightly and let the silence settle again. Not wounded this time, but deliberate. "You're right," I said, looking directly at Richard Carter. "This isn't about embarrassment." He didn't answer. Neither did Evelyn. But I saw it then, that tiny shift in their faces. Not guilt. Not shame. Calculation. They were still measuring risk. Good. So was I. "This is about judgment," I continued. "About what kind of people decide who belongs in a room like this. and what kind of mistakes that leads to. A few people near the front leaned forward. Daniel stood frozen halfway between the stage and his parents' table, like he still believed he could stop this if he found the right words quickly enough. He wasn't going to. Because the problem tonight, I said, my voice calm now, clear enough to reach the back wall, isn't that my father wore the wrong jacket. No one moved. The problem is that your family made a decision based on appearances. And that decision tells me everything I need to know. Richard took one step forward. Hannah, he said, firmer now. Enough. I looked at him. No, I said. Not yet. The room went still again. Then I did something I had not planned to do tonight. Not here, not like this. But there are moments when life removes every softer option and leaves only the truth. The holding company behind Ridgeway Capital, I said slowly, belongs to me. For a second, nothing happened. Not confusion, not denial. Just that brief, strange silence that comes when people hear something too unexpected to process. Then, I watched it spread. A man near the second table turned to the woman beside him. Someone else reached for a phone. Another guest straightened in his chair and stared at Richard. Daniel's face changed first. Not outrage, recognition. He knew the name. Of course he did. His father's company had spent the last year depending on Ridgeway Capital to keep a major redevelopment project moving through a difficult quarter. It wasn't a secret in their world, just the kind of fact they assumed would always stay at a distance, handled through board members, attorneys, layers of paper, and polished introductions. They knew the money. They never cared to know the person. Richard let out a short, disbelieving breath. That's absurd. Is it? I asked. I looked out at the room, not at him. Ridgeway is structured through a family trust and managed under legal representation. My name isn't printed on the materials your guests see. That was intentional. Now the phones were fully out. I heard a whisper from somewhere near the center of the room. Wait, she's serious. Evelyn's posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough. That was the first crack. I wasn't going to say any of this tonight, I continued. But then your family decided to show me exactly what they respect. I turned my head slightly toward the back of the room, and it clearly isn't character. No verdict had landed yet. No contract had changed hands. No one had fallen. But I could feel the machinery beginning to turn. And this time, it wasn't built for them. That was when the room stopped belonging to them. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic sweep where everyone gasped and pointed, and the world turned upside down in a single second. It happened the way real power usually shifts. Quietly first, then all at once. Phones were already out. Screens lit up across the tables closest to the stage. People weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, through me, toward the implications of what I had just said. Ridgeway Capital. I watched recognition move through the room in waves. One of Richard Carter's business associates, a gray-haired man I had seen shaking his hand earlier that evening, leaned toward another guest and said something too low for me to hear. The other man's face changed almost immediately. At the table beside them, a woman in a dark green dress unlocked her phone, searched something, then looked up sharply toward Evelyn. This was no longer a family matter. That was the point. Richard stepped forward again, but he no longer looked composed. You're making a serious accusation in front of people who don't understand the full picture, he said. His tone clipped now, each word chosen too carefully. This is not the place for business. I met his eyes. No, I said. It became that the moment your family decided character was less important than status. A murmur rose again, louder this time. Daniel finally moved closer to the stage, close enough now that I could see the panic behind his attempt at control. Hannah, he said, keeping his voice low, trying one last time to pull this back into something private, manageable. Please, let's go somewhere and talk. I almost laughed. Talk. That word had covered so much for so long. Delayed, softened, hidden. I shook my head. There's nothing left to discuss, I said. Then I looked out at the guests again. I want to be very clear, I continued. Starting on the next business day, my legal team will request an emergency review of Ridgeway's exposure to Carter development. That landed. This time, No one needed to search what it meant. Richard's face lost color, not dramatically, just enough. Evelyn's mouth parted slightly before she closed it again. Daniel stood still, as if movement itself might make this more real. I kept going. And every partner in this room who has financial ties to that project should know this, I said. If my family can be humiliated this easily in public, then I have no reason to believe your judgment is better in private. That was a sentence that did it. Not because it was louder, because it connected everything. Not just cruelty, judgment, risk, exposure. A man near the front, someone I recognized from a dinner months earlier, one of Carter Development's lenders, stood from his chair and quietly stepped away from the table. He wasn't leaving the room, but he was creating distance. Others noticed. Richard noticed, and that was the first real consequence he could not argue away. "This is outrageous," Evelyn said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried all night. I turned toward her. "No," I said. What was outrageous was making my mother sit there and pretend she wasn't being humiliated. Silence. Heavy. Total. Then I reached for my left hand. I looked down at the ring Daniel had placed there. A clean diamond. Elegant. Expensive. Chosen, I had once believed, because he knew me well enough to understand that I would never want something flashy. Now it looked like what it really was. A promise attached to the wrong family. I slid it off slowly. The tiny sound it made when I placed it on the edge of the stage was somehow louder than my voice had been. Daniel stared at it first, then at me. "Hannah." "No," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "This wedding is over." No one moved. No one came forward. The music had stopped completely now. Even the staff stood still, caught in that strange suspended moment when everyone understands that something irreversible has just happened. I looked once toward the back of the room. My father was still seated, but not bowed now. My mother's face was wet with tears, but she wasn't hiding anymore. And for the first time that night, I knew the humiliation had changed direction. Not disappeared. Changed. No one tried to stop me. That was the part I remember most clearly. Not the silence, though it was complete. Not the look on Daniel's face, though I knew I would remember that too. Not even the ring, resting on the edge of the stage, catching the light like something expensive and suddenly meaningless. It was the fact that, in a room full of people who had spent the entire evening deciding who belonged and who didn't, not one of them stood in my way when I walked down from that stage. I didn't look at Daniel again. I had already seen enough. Instead, I stepped down slowly, the hem of my dress brushing the polished floor, and crossed the room toward the back table where my parents were still seated. The same table they had been sent to, as if they should have been grateful just to be allowed inside. My mother stood first. Her eyes were still wet, but her shoulders were different now, straighter, like something inside her had settled, even if it still hurt. My father rose beside her, his face unreadable for a moment, then softer when he looked at me. "Hannah," he said quietly, that was all. No lecture, no warning, no attempt to tell me I had gone too far, just my name. I reached for my mother's hand first, then my father's. "Let's go home," I said. And for the first time that night, the word home didn't feel small. It felt clear. We walked together through the center of the ballroom. Not hurried, not dramatic, just steady. Tables that had once felt intimidating no longer looked that way. The chandeliers were still bright. The flowers were still perfect. The room was still expensive and polished and carefully arranged. But it had changed. Or maybe I had. Somewhere behind us, I heard a chair scrape the floor. A voice, low and urgent. Another phone ringing. The beginning of consequences, moving faster than anyone there could control. I didn't turn around to see who was already trying to fix it. I knew enough. The review would happen on the next business day. The lenders in that room would remember what they had seen. The people who mattered had watched a family reveal exactly how they treated those they thought had less power. That kind of truth doesn't disappear because the music starts again. At the doors, I paused just long enough to look back once. Not at Daniel, not at Evelyn, not at Richard. At the room itself, at the place where I had almost agreed to build a life by making myself smaller. And I felt something I hadn't felt all evening. Not victory, Not relief, something quieter than that. Alignment. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The city lights of Charlotte stretched beyond the hotel entrance, steady and familiar. My father took off his jacket and folded it over one arm. My mother let out a long breath she had probably been holding for hours. Then my father looked at me and said, "You didn't let them rewrite us." I swallowed hard, because that was exactly what it had been. Not just humiliation. Not just class or pride or cruelty. It had been an attempt to redefine my family in front of people who were willing to believe it, and I had refused. I leaned into my mother for a moment, then looked at both of them. "I'm sorry," I said. My mother shook her head immediately. "No," she said softly. "Not for tonight." My father nodded once. Some things cost what they cost. There was no triumph in his voice, just truth. And maybe that was the final lesson of it all. Justice doesn't always feel loud when it's real. Sometimes it feels like standing in the cold air after walking out of a room that was never built for your peace. I lost a wedding that night. I lost a future I had once tried very hard to believe in. But I kept something far more important: my family, my name, and the part of myself that still knew the difference between being chosen and being respected. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your dignity, I'd love to know what that moment looked like for you. Share your thoughts below, and if this story stayed with you, like, subscribe, and come back for the next one. Sometimes the stories that heal us most are the ones where someone finally refuses to stay silent.